So we have been going through this series that we've titled Reasons for Faith, and we're in part two of a lesson. We started it, and it was obvious that there was just way too much material to talk about to finish, and so we have carried on from a couple weeks ago with the discussion of whether we can trust a translated Bible or not. And what we had noted in the first lesson of this is that Jesus and the New Testament writers trusted a translated Bible. That is, that they used the Septuagint. And we gave a number of examples where the text that we have in the New Testament aligns with exactly how the Septuagint is worded, rather than the Masoretic text, which is a Hebrew text that would come later on. And so we see that Jesus and the disciples were using a translation, which of course made sense. They were talking with people who primarily were using the Greek language. And so if they started speaking to them in Hebrew, many of them would not understand or not fully grasp what was being said. And we had looked back in the time of Nehemiah and noted that even in Nehemiah's time, there were many of the Jews who were not speaking Hebrew. Nehemiah said something to the effect that they're speaking the language of Ashdod. They have married these women from pagan nations, and the children are growing up learning those languages rather than the Hebrew language. And I suspect it didn't get much better by the time we get to the time of Christ. And so the people are not, at least en masse, well versed in the Hebrew tongue. And so the Lord and the disciples spoke to them and cited a text that was in the language that they were customarily using. We also discussed the question of whether there was any room for the text of the New Testament to be corrupted, because that is an accusation that some will make, that bit by bit over time, people have come in and corrupted the text, and therefore we can't trust it. Some have made specific claims that the Roman Catholic Church may have corrupted the text, which is a claim that is entirely built upon false assumptions and claims. But there just simply is no room for the text to have been corrupted, and the number of times that the Bible was copied, and in particular the New Testament, the number of times that it was copied leaves very little room for that to take place. But we had spent a bit of time towards the end of our lesson last time looking at this claim that somehow the Roman Catholic Church could have done it. And so we noted when the Roman Catholic Church began, which was 606 AD, and then we worked our way backwards from that to demonstrate that the 66 books of the Bible that you and I acknowledge as being in the Bible were being quoted by a number of people long before you get to 606 AD. And so the Council of Hippo in 390 AD, the Nicene Council in 331 AD, the work of Eusebius, who was charged by the Roman officials to make 50 copies of the entire scriptures. And he put the 66 books of that you and I acknowledge as being Bible books within there. Codex Sinacanus and Vaticanus were among the works that he had done. We looked at Origen of Alexandria in 254, and Tertullian in 222, and Clement of Alexandria in 215. And the dates just keep getting closer and closer and closer to when the New Testament was written. And we've got all these people who are acknowledging, yeah, these are the inspired books. And so there was no room for somebody to slide some things in that don't belong there. There was no place for that to happen. So today I want us to continue with this and spend a bit of time looking at manuscript evidence in particular. And the reason I want us to look at manuscript evidence is, well, where do we get our translations from, right? It's from manuscripts that have been saved and been found throughout the ages. And so it makes sense to look at manuscript evidence. And as we do so, I want us to start by looking at manuscript evidence for other ancient documents. That will be our beginning point, just to establish that on the whole, there's a lot of documents from ancient times that don't have a massive amount of manuscript evidence to back them. And yet, you don't hear people calling into question whether what we have from these various writers is actually what they wrote or if somebody messed with it. You don't hear those kinds of claims. And so let's begin with Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder, who was a Roman naturalist and philosopher. The greatest work that he wrote was called Naturalis Historia, which was a nature and geographical encyclopedia. There are only 7 copies of his work available. And as you see, he's writing between 61 and 113 AD. The earliest copy that's available is from 850 AD. So we've got a span of about 750 years between when he wrote and the earliest available copy that we have of what he wrote. And it may not, we're not even talking about necessarily full copy. It may be that we're dealing with fragments of copies as well. But 750 years removed from the original work, only 7 copies available. Plato, you've likely heard of this guy, right? Plato, Greek philosopher, mathematician, a student of Socrates, best known for his work entitled Socratic Dialogues, 36 dialogues and 13 letters within that. Again, only 7 copies available, or fragments of copies available. And we've got a huge time span. He's writing back between 427 and 347 BC, and the earliest available is in 900 AD. That's 1250 years thereabouts. That's a lot of time to pass between when Plato was writing and the earliest available copy of the things that Plato had written. Well, Suetonius. Suetonius is a Roman historian. He wrote a series of biographies of successive Roman rulers from Julius Caesar through to Domitian. And we have 8 copies of works from Suetonius, or fragments of copies available. 75 to 160 AD is when he's writing. 950 is approximately when the earliest copy has been dated to. You've got a span of 800 years there between when he wrote and the earliest available copy of what he wrote. Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. Of course, Roman general, statesman, consul, and author. His writings, primarily the things that survived, are war commentaries. That's what has survived of the works of Julius Caesar. But there's only about 10 copies or fragments of copies available. And we're talking about a time span of 950 years between when he stopped writing and the earliest available to us. Tacitus, Roman senator and historian. 2 major works that Tacitus had put together, the Annals and the Histories, which are documents that look at the reigns of Tiberius and Claudius and Nero. We've got about 20 copies available, or fragments of copies. And again, the time frame, we're looking at about 1,000 years between when he wrote and the earliest available copy to us. Aristotle, Greek philosopher. He was a student of Plato. He was actually the teacher of Alexander the Great. Very prolific writer. He addressed all kinds of things: physics, metaphysics, poetry, theater, music, logic, rhetoric, linguistics, politics, ethics, biology, zoology, and the list just keeps on going. He writes and writes and writes and writes. And so, but of his writings, there are a mere 49 copies or fragments of copies available. And the time frame is rather expansive. We've got about 1,350 years between when he was putting pen to paper and the earliest available copy of what he was writing. Sophocles. Sophocles was a Greek playwright. Of his works, 193 available. Only 7 of his plays that he has written have actually survived, but we have 193 combined copies of those plays that he had written, but they're 1,400 years removed from when he wrote it. And so big time span. Homer, you're likely familiar with Homer, Greek poet, epic writer, best known for the Iliad and for the Odyssey. 643, that's really good, right? When you look at the rest of the list, the 643, he's knocking it out of the park so far as the number of copies of his work that have survived till our modern time. Now, of course, he was writing back in 900, and we've got 400 BC as the earliest copy. That's only a span of 500 years as well. So this is looking pretty good when we're talking about Homer. The New Testament is in a different class. In fact, the New Testament, I've read some writers who say there is an embarrassing amount of evidence available for the New Testament. So with the New Testament, there is a 30-year span between the time of writing and the earliest available copy. 30-year span. Now, that's not all of the copies that are available. Some of them are hundreds of years out. Some of them are a little bit closer, but there is a fragment of the Gospel of John known as the John Ryland fragment, and it is 30 years removed from the time that John wrote. That's really close. Not only that, but the sheer number of copies or fragments of copies available, and the 5,800 that I've got listed there, which just blows everything else out of the water, that's only those that are written in Greek. That's all that number represents. And so there are 5,800 copies or fragments of copies of Greek manuscripts that support New Testament writings. And then if you add in Latin manuscripts, what was the language of the Roman people, right? It was Latin. And so it got widespread as well in the Latin language. If you add in Latin, that's another 10,000 manuscripts to add on to the 5,800. And then if we add in the Syriac and the Slavic and the Gothic and the Ethiopic and the Coptic and the Armenian, that's another 9,300 manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts, which means that in total, that number balloons to 25,000 plus. I'll say that one more time. 25,000 plus copies or fragments of copies, with the earliest of those, again, being only 30 years removed from the original source. Can we trust the New Testament? And that maybe our translations, which are based upon these copies, nobody has originals, right? There are no originals available. You're not going to find what Paul sat down and well, Paul didn't write it, right? He had somebody else write it on his behalf. You're not going to find that exact document that came from the pen of whoever the scribe was that was working with Paul. You're going to find copies of that, but you're going to find a lot of copies of that. Bart Ehrman, who is a liberal textual critic, he is the head of the Department of Religious Studies. I believe he's the chairman there at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has stated, "It is true, of course, that the New Testament is abundantly attested in the manuscripts produced through the ages, but most of these manuscripts are many centuries removed from the originals, and none of them perfectly accurate. They all contain mistakes, altogether many thousands of mistakes. It is not an easy task to reconstruct the original words of the New Testament." So here is a textual critic who is working in a Bible department. Let me correct myself, religious studies department. So I'm guessing it's a little bit broader than just Bible. But he is saying, hey, I know there's a lot. You still can't trust it. You still can't trust it. That's what he's saying. There's a whole bunch out there. I grant that. But none of them are perfectly accurate. In fact, they contain mistakes altogether, thousands, many thousands of mistakes. You can't reconstruct the original words of the New Testament. That is what you would have us believe. And therefore, we should just fold it up and go home, right? Well, regarding the manuscripts being many centuries removed, that is true for a lot of them. Absolutely. But that's also true for every other document of antiquity, right? How many people are calling into question the writing of Aristotle and the writing of Plato and the writings of Homer? And whether, you can't know that you have what they wrote. This is entirely different. Nobody says that. So sure, yes, many of them were from are many centuries removed, but there are others which are within a few centuries or less. I didn't mention it when I was talking about the John Ryland portion of text, but there are others such as the Chester Beatty Papyrus and the Bodmer Papyrus II, which are very, very close. They're not 30 years removed, but they're within 100 or so years. And so there are certainly manuscripts that are very, very close to the time of the original documents. Regarding the many mistakes, and I've seen this quote of his floating around on social media and so forth, and being used at times to cast doubt on the authenticity of the New Testament and whether we can trust it or not. Ehrman and others, for shock value, use that statement. And in fact, there's another statement of his which says that there are upwards of 400,000 errors in the New Testament. Something like that just would baffle the mind. Like, how can I trust a document that has upwards of 400,000 errors in it, right? That just sounds astounding until you realize that an error is identified as any variance whatsoever. And when he's saying up to 400,000, he's talking about over the whole expanse of all of the documents available. Would we say 25,000 plus, right? He's not saying in one document. He's saying over the expanse of all of that, there are upwards of 400,000. But what is considered to be an error? Any kind of variance whatsoever. So if a word is omitted, just a single word omitted, well, that's an error. Well, I acknowledge that. That's an error. But if the word in is missing from a sentence, can I still figure out what the sentence was saying? I think I can, right? If a word is misspelled, or if the word arrangement is changed, those are certainly errors. If it's misspelled, if somebody is spelling the word table and they left the E off the end, can I figure out the word table from T-A-B-L? I'm able to do that, right? And so the nature of the errors are not such that, the message is gone based upon these errors. The rearranging of words in English, the word order is very important in English, right? In Greek, it's not as important, the order of the words, and you'll find where we have to reorder it from the Greek to English sometimes for it to even make sense in our language. That doesn't mean that word order isn't important at all, but it's not as important as in our English. And so as they're writing, the scribes may have got ahead of themselves and got a word in there that's supposed to come later, and then they carry on with the word they missed and move on, right? And so that's an error, of course, the rearranging of words. In any other document, especially given the mass number of manuscripts that we're talking about, would those errors ever be mentioned? Oh, there was some spelling mistakes in there. There was a word missing. Another error that happens from time to time, a line ends up being copied twice. Well, you're not missing anything, right? It's in there a second time, if that's the case. And in fact, Ehrman himself would subsequently state, of all the hundreds of thousands of textual changes found among our manuscripts, most of them are completely insignificant. All right, so why did you mention it in order to cause doubt in the first place then? If you, when you are called upon it, will say they are completely insignificant, immaterial, of no real importance for anything other than showing that scribes could not spell or keep focused any better than the rest of us. All right, so what was the point in bringing the number up and in causing the doubt? And in the previous quote, what did he say? It is not an easy task to reconstruct the original words of the New Testament. I interpret that statement to mean you can't know for certain that what's in there is actually what was in the original documents. And yet his subsequent quote, he says, it's just evidence that the scribes couldn't spell any better than we can. Isn't that just like we make mistakes from time to time? They did too. Insignificant, immaterial, and of no real importance. Those are his words. So can we trust the manuscript evidence that supports the New Testament? I believe the answer is a resounding yes. Even Ehrman acknowledges the variances and the mistakes in the New Testament are basically a non-issue. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about the Old Testament. The manuscript evidence for the Old Testament is nowhere as extensive for the New Testament. So New Testament, we said 25,000 plus, right? You're not going to find that for the Old Testament. We had mentioned previously in our last lesson that, we've got the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We've got the Masoretic. In addition to those, there's the Vulgate, which is the Latin, and there's the Targum, which is Aramaic, and the Coptic, and a few others that are well known. And then with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, there were copies of Old Testament writings that were produced there in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. But despite the much smaller number of ancient Hebrew manuscripts available to us, the copying process that the Jewish scribes used would attest to the exceptional accuracy of the Old Testament. So the Talmud, that's a historical document among the Jews which has traditions in it and so forth. The Talmud gives rules for scribes to follow as they are making a copy of the Hebrew scriptures. And so here is what they are to do. So the scribe must verbalize each word aloud while writing it. So it's not just a matter of sight. I also must say the word as I am writing it. Do you know how many mistakes will not happen because of doing that? If you are reading and saying what you are writing, you have sight, you have verbalization, and you've written it down, that's going to get rid of a lot of mistakes that you would make, right? So the scribe must read it aloud as he is writing. The scribe is not permitted to focus on the sentence as a whole. You and I, we might look at a sentence and we start writing down the sentence, and we maybe check a few times to go back and make sure that we're getting the whole thought of the sentence, right? That is not how they were working. They were not to focus on the sentence. They focused on the word. They said the word, they wrote the word, but not even really the word. What they're focusing on is each letter inside the word as they are recording it. And that's important. We'll come to that in just a little bit. But the sheer focus involved in this indicates that the authenticity of the copy should be trusted, or is likely to be trusted. The scribe must wash his body and clean his pen every time before and after writing the name of God. Now, that's a tradition that the Jews had among their scribes. But what it does tell you is that they have just an absolute focus on the importance of this task. When they are writing these books out, when they are copying these, they understand that this is God's message. And so if I come to the name of God, then I am going to stop. I am going to cleanse myself. I'm going to cleanse my writing utensil. I will write God's name, and then I will cleanse myself and my writing utensil again as I carry on. This is about the mindset of the scribe. In the copying process, the letters and words and paragraphs in the document must be counted. You must have the correct number of letters in the document, the correct number of words, the correct number of paragraphs. And if it does not match the original, then the document will be destroyed. And so they know, or they knew, I don't know that today's scribes, there's printing presses now, right? And so, but the scribes knew as they were doing a copy of Genesis, let's say, they knew what the middle word of the whole book of Genesis is. I have no idea what the middle word of Genesis is. I'm not a scribe, so I don't need to know. But they knew what the middle word of the book of Genesis is. And not only that, they knew what the middle letter of the whole book of Genesis is. And so after they have finished their copy, they go through and they count through the words to get to the middle word. And it has to be the right word. Now understand, the middle letter is not likely going to sit in the middle word either, because some words are longer and some words are shorter. And so the likelihood that the middle letter is also in the middle word, I don't think so. So they've counted through, that's one check to make sure that it's the right word. Well, first of all, the middle paragraph, make sure that they've got the right paragraph in the middle, right? But then the middle word, it has to be the right word. And then they count through again, now counting letters, and they need to come to the right letter. And if they do not have the correct paragraph, do not have the correct word, do not have the correct letter, guess what happens to the copy? You crunch it up, you toss it aside, you start over. With that kind of focus, how much doubt should we have that the scribes were actually doing their job? These are professional scribes that we're describing here. They are making sure that they are giving an exact copy. The middle paragraph, word and letter must match. If not, then it's going to be destroyed. If two letters in the document touch each other, the document is destroyed. That might seem a little nitpicky, but when you're transcribing God's word, when your duty is to take that and produce a copy of it, can you be too nitpicky, right? And so the copying process that was used by the Hebrew scribes attests to the fact that they were giving an exact copy of what was available. And so we don't have as many manuscripts available. They destroyed a whole bunch of manuscripts, the ones that had the errors in it, they destroyed them. And were focused on perfection of the copy that they were making. All right, so we could dig into those things a whole lot more, both on the New Testament side and the Old Testament side. And I'd love to have that conversation if you want to dig into it deeper, because there's a lot more to look at in both cases. And we could dig into that if you so desire. But let's close out just simply acknowledging that all translations are not created equal. So now I'm coming back to our modern day translations. And not every translation is created equal. I do believe that we can trust translations, yes, but there are some translations that I would trust more than other translations. And so, again, this is something that we could dig into a lesson all onto its own, but let me just give a few brief things as we close out our lesson today. We're not going to talk about translating committees and all those kinds of things. That's for further discussion. But understand this, that the translation process will take one of two directions. Either it will be dynamic equivalence or it will be formal equivalence. Well, what's the difference between those two? Dynamic equivalence, if we wanted to put it in an easier word for that, it's paraphrase. Anyone want a paraphrased Bible? Somebody telling you what they thought God meant to say? Right? I'm not in favor of that. Formal equivalence, literal, would be the idea. Now, again, it's not going to be exactly literal, because if we took a literal Greek New Testament and just word for word went through, there are sections of it that would be very difficult for us to understand. Again, just the formation of sentences in Greek versus the formation of sentences in English, there is some difference in that. And you know, in English, it's got to be much more tighter for it to actually make sense for us, right? One of my favorite translations is Young's literal translation, but you will never hear me preach from Young's literal translation. It's awkward to do so, right? Because it's very, very focused on providing a literal word for word, and even within the order of the words. All right, so those are the two translating styles. And so one is more of an interpretation. That's what paraphrase would be. And the other one is as much as can fit within English sentence structure, a literal translation. I will take the formal equivalence every day of the week over the dynamic equivalence. I don't want somebody telling me what they think the Bible says. I want to read what the Bible says. And if it's tough, okay, I'll put the time in, I'll put the prayer in, and I will, with God's help, I will figure out what he's saying, right? I want God's word, not what a translating committee said God's word says. Now, the paraphrases are often much wordier. I'm going to use Romans chapter 8, verse 3 and 4 as an example. So I'm going to read it, first of all, from the New King James Bible, which is my usual Bible to use. New King James, Romans chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. And then I'm going to read it from the Good News Bible after that. And I want you to hear the difference in this. So this is the New King James, which is a good literal translation. Romans chapter 8, verse 3. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh. On account of sin, he condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. All right, so that is the that is New King James. The same verse from the Good News Bible, and wouldn't you know it, I actually didn't put it in my notes. Let me open up my Bible app and go find that. That is odd. If there was ever a time to put something in my notes, that would be it, because I don't use Good News Bible. So Romans chapter 8 and verses 3 and 4. Hopefully this Bible app that I'm using actually has the Good News Bible in it. Good News Bible. There we go. Well, that's not the right one. That's Good News Bible UK. My apologies. I thought I had it in there.
You are forgiven.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I'm not seeing.
It's a good time for everybody to work on their patience.
There we go. Yes, please be patient with me. I am not seeing the particular translation. Let me try one more here.
Do you have in your notes what translation you were speaking of?
Yeah, it's supposed to be the Good News GNB. Yeah.
GNB.
But Yeah, and I'm looking through. This is that Bible app U version, and I'm not seeing the Good News Bible. GNB. I'm finding GNB DC, GNB DK, GNB UK, and none of those are reading exactly as the American version of it. What's that? Good News Translation. Maybe that would be it. And my notes I put GNB, but let's see if GNT. All right, I'll try one more here, and we'll see if this does it. And if not, I'll just note a couple of the things that it says. No, it's not GNT either. All right.
Looks like,
Oh,
There you go. I think that's it.
let's see.
it's a GNT.
Yeah. Well, let's give this a shot. All right. So, what the law could not do because human nature was weak, God did. He condemned sin in human nature by sending his own son, who came with a nature like our sinful nature to do away with sin. God did this so that the righteous demand of the law might be fulfilled or fully satisfied in us who live according to the Spirit and not according to human nature. All right, that one's bad, but that's not the one that I was looking at. So, but let me just give a couple of notations from the one that I was looking at. Obviously, I wrote down the wrong translation, but the one that I had noted, very wordy. It talked about how God, grasped something by the jugular. The Greek text says nothing about grasping something by the jugular, right? It talks about here it says human nature, the other one says human condition. It talks about putting a band-aid on something. That's a brand name, right? Band-aid. They didn't have band-aids back in Paul's day when he's writing to the Romans. What are you saying band-aid for, right? That is not a translation. What it does is it just presents a whole lot of wordy things that people today use those kinds of words and like that kind of hype. God did not grab anything by the jugular. Okay, that's not a good translation of Romans chapter 8 verse 3 and 4, nor of any text in the New Testament or in the Bible in general. And what it does, and this one that Jeremy had given to me, what translation was it? Good News Translation. Okay. This and the NIV used to do this as well. It presents the false concept of the fact that we're born in sin, the sin nature, the human condition. That's not what the text says. The text says the Greek word sarx, which is literally flesh. It's not sinful flesh, it's just literally flesh. Jesus came in the flesh. He didn't come in sinful flesh. And they acknowledge that, and they have to do some wrangling of words in order to get around their doctrine. And so we do need to be careful because there are some translations which the translating committees had a bias. And so be very cautious. Now, I mentioned New International Version. Let me say this. In 2014, the NIV Translating Committee corrected a lot of their false biases that had gone into the previous translation. And they took a beating for it. There were people who were hating on them because they changed, specifically in Romans 8, but in other places as well, to what was a good translation of the Greek text. And that upset some people. But give me what the Bible says any day over what somebody interprets the Bible to say. So New King James, good translation. Are there issues in it? There are. Again, that's a discussion for another day, but I believe we can trust the New King James. Good News Bible, I wouldn't even suggest using it as a reading Bible. Doorstop, maybe. But it, at the same time, on the whole, you can get the message, but there's going to be some, unfortunately, doctrines that are in it that have been, that are false doctrines. I'm just going to fill the screen in with a number of translations on either end of the spectrum type thing here. New King James, New American Standard, Revised Standard, NIV, ESV, King James Version. And there may be others that go with that, but they are all literal translations. They are all formal equivalents. Again, NIV and RSV, I've got them slightly back this way from where the others are. Over here, the Good News Bible, TV, I don't even remember what TV is, The Voice, CEV, TLB, The Message, they're all paraphrased. Just don't use them, right? Now, sometimes I'll quote from one of those because I think I'll use it as commentary, and they got something right. But those are not good Bibles to be using. And then the NET, GNT, and CEV, again, they're sort of dynamic equivalents, but they're not as far off as some of the others are.
Should our response be when people will bring this to the surface, to the fact that there is some mistakes in the New King James Version?
So we are using a translation of a copy 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 of a copy, right? And so the only text that was inspired was when that writer sat down, the original writer sat down and they wrote, or they dictated to their scribe. That is what God inspired. But I do believe as we look at the copying process, both Old Testament and New Testament, we have sufficient evidence to say, yeah, there were some errors that have slipped in, but those errors are so minute, so minor, that the meaning of the text certainly did not change. And then we today need to have some measure of confidence in translating committees, which is why I think something like this is absolutely important to know the difference between what gives you a New King James versus a Good News Bible, right? And so always go towards tell me what God said, I'll figure it out, rather than tell me what you think God said and I'll accept it. Now, the New King James, does it have some issues? It does. It has in 1 John chapter 5 at verse 7, a portion of text that does not belong there. And if you go to the New American Standard, that portion of text is not there. And that's based upon which manuscripts were being used by those translating committees in order to get to the final product. And so, there's a much bigger discussion in that. You will never hear me use 1 John 5, verse 7 to support the doctrine of the Godhead. It talks about the Father, Son, and Spirit being one. There are three who are one. And that's not in the original text, and therefore I treat it as though it's not part of the Bible. When I'm studying 1 John chapter 5 with somebody, we're going to acknowledge this isn't supposed to be there. That teaching is biblical, but that was likely a notation that was made in a side column or something of that nature in one of the manuscripts. Maybe somebody, when they were studying, made a notation down in the side column, and then somebody else in a future time was using that manuscript in order to make a copy, and they just stuck it into the text rather than acknowledging, oh, this was somebody's notes that they wrote on the side, and it made its way in. So
there are three that bear witness in heaven: the Father, the Word, the Holy Spirit. These one.
Wouldn't that be convenient, right? Because here you got Father, Son, Holy Spirit right there. And, John just lays it out for us. We don't have to doubt whether there's three persons to the Godhead or not. It's there. That verse doesn't belong in the Bible. Yeah. But the teaching of the Godhead is found elsewhere in the Bible. We don't need that verse. And again, you will not hear me using that verse in any lesson dealing with the Godhead. So,
because it was not a part of the original manuscript.
Right. Yeah. So if you go to the New American Standard and you check that same text in New American Standard, they have a notation there that says some translations have, but they don't have that text in the Bible text. And so again, it's a matter of which manuscripts were being used by the translating committees themselves. So.
Were any similar like this, like the exact same error?
That is the most egregious that I'm familiar with. And it's a matter of an addition, not a subtraction. And we can see that it is an addition. So, yeah. All right, let's go ahead. We'll draw this to a close. So the question was, can we trust a translated Bible? I believe the answer is absolutely. And again, we started by noting that Jesus and the apostles trusted a translated Old Testament. And so that counts for something, right? If the Lord is using a translation, it would be very odd for us to then declare, we can't do that, right? We can use a translation. We don't need to learn the Hebrew and Greek languages. Fortunately, there are some people who do know there's those languages, and we need to place a measure of confidence in them and get to know their character perhaps and know that, okay, they're being honest with how they deal with the Bible. And for the most part, I think that most certainly is the case. The number of manuscripts that we're talking about, again, that attests to the fact that we can trust in this. The nature of translation always lean towards formal equivalence, always lean towards somebody saying, hey, here's what God said, go figure it out. And if we will do that, I am confident we can know God's will and that we can serve him faithfully as we seek to obey it. If we can help you in your walk with the Lord, let us know how. We can be encouraging you, opening our Bibles and studying on various topics. Maybe you want to dig into this a little bit more. Let's do that. Right? If there's some way we can be an encouragement and help you in your faith, let us know as we stand and as we sing.